On the theme of blending realism with hope, we've got to be realistic about how deep the problems are, but there's got to be optimism and a plan for a way forwards as well. So how would you A, diagnose the problem, and B, find that optimism?
Brilliant. Well, Gavin, thank you for the invite. I'm sorry to keep you waiting today. I got stuck on a broken down train from my constituency, which, if you're ever looking for a parallel of parable of the breakdown of the British state, that was it. The times when you wish you were on Marine One, and that was one of them. But anyway, I'm here, and so thank you very much for organising this today. I thought I'd focus on four things, which are huge challenges facing this country and the United States, where there are commonalities but also points of contrast, and many of them build on what we've just heard from Henry and from Nick. The first one, which I'm incredibly concerned about now, is the level of debt that there is in this country. And here I think there is a difference between the way in which the Conservative right in the UK is beginning to respond to this and the Conservative right in the United States is handling this situation. And of course the US has many structural advantages over the UK, but nonetheless I think it's in a very difficult position with the level of debt that it is having. And whether that comes home to roost immediately or in many years' time, I think it will do. Here in the UK, I think the rubber has hit the road. And I'm absolutely terrified that unless Rachel Reeves changes course very quickly, we will see a financial crisis. And that will be a financial crisis of a scale that is akin to what we experienced in 2008. And that will mean, in a practical sense, tens of thousands of people being severely impacted, tens of thousands of homeowners potentially facing the repossession of their homes, thousands of people being made homeless, thousands of small businesses facing debt repayments that they just cannot handle, so their businesses go under. And that debt crisis is coming. It may even come within the next 12 months. And we as Conservatives have to have an answer to that. And the answer is obviously that the state is far too large and we've got to cut public spending now. And we've got to do that in several areas, but above all else, in welfare. We cannot allow the benefits bill in this country to continue to soar in the way it has in recent years. And that is having absolutely devastating consequences for our public finances. We've seen that it's not going to happen under Starmer, where he can't even get past his backbenches the most minor reforms to welfare, which don't even cut the welfare bill, but enable it to grow less fast. It's got to happen under a centre-right government after the next general election. But the damage that could be done in the next couple of years, I think, is absolutely devastating. And we have to be prophets of that, but I don't just want to be a kind of Cassandra and the country suffer for it. We've got to urge Starmer and Rachel Reeves to change course very quickly, or else the consequences are going to be extremely severe. And you will have seen the debt figures that have come out this morning, which are very, very concerning. I think the first 5 months of the year, we were borrowing 165 billion pounds, 11 billion pounds, I think, more than even the OBR estimated in March of this year. So this is an escalating crisis. And we are taking a different position to our American cousins in this respect, where, broadly speaking, they've chosen to borrow more in the face of this very concerning situation. The second point I was going to make, which builds very much on what Nick both has said today and has been arguing for a very long time, extremely eloquently, when some of these arguments were unfashionable, is that it's not the only causes that he's taken up that are unfashionable, has to be said. We have to re-industrialize this country. The story of the 20th century was the loss of so much of our industrial base. The story of much of my lifetime was, my parents are both people who grew up in the 40s and 50s, went to work in heavy industry in Manchester and Liverpool, which is all now long gone. They watched the destruction of our heavy industry in the 60s and the 70s due to poor management and out of control trade unions, which continued through the 1980s, but is still continuing to this day. And our industrial base, I think, was about 13% of GDP in 2002. That's now fallen to, I think, 9% a couple of years ago. Whatever the latest figures are, will almost certainly be less than that.
8.5.
8.5, thank you. Should have known that you would have the numbers. As we're seeing, the destruction of our chemicals industry, our steel industry, our car industry. Yeah. And there's been totally magical thinking in recent years in which we have pursued an energy policy which is deindustrializing our country and impoverishing people here. There are no prizes for being the first country in the world to decarbonize. We've embarked on unilateral economic disarmament, and that has to end. You can't have an economy in which industrial energy prices are 4 times that of the United States, where they're, I think, 30% higher than even Germany's industrial energy prices. That's got to end. What does that mean? Well, exactly as Nick said, it almost certainly means junking the Climate Change Act. It probably means building a new generation of gas-fired power stations. It means maximising economic recovery in the North Sea. And it probably means, if it's economically viable, exploring fracking in those parts of the country where it can happen. And I'm not a NIMBY on this. The licences for fracking were there in my own constituency in North Nottinghamshire. And I held public meetings back in the day where I advocated it. And we were able to persuade people that there are arguments for it. So we've got to have a totally different energy policy, and that's got to happen as soon as possible, or else we're going to put ourselves in the most challenging position. And what I worry for the country is that there is no economic plan for this country. We live in a country where, thanks to the last Conservative government and now Ed Miliband's crazy net zero on steroids approach, we are decimating what little remains of our industrial base and relying ever more on a service-based economy, just at the very moment that AI is going to completely decimate or change that forever. And that is going to mean that the world of work changes, that millions of middle-class people who were content with good, respectable jobs are going to find them gone forever and unclear what their future is. We're not an AI superpower, whatever Keir Starmer said at the press conference today. I wish we were. We have to take steps to try to do that. But for once, I agree with Nick Clegg. We're basically becoming a vassal state to American AI technology. And this is going to pose immense challenges to people in this country. We've got to have a proper economic plan to handle that, and we've got to reindustrialize as quickly as we can. The third point is around housing and planning. And here, there are really good examples we can point to in the US, where at a state level, American Republicans have brought forward genuine planning reforms to drive economic growth and to build a better future for their citizens. Look at places like Texas and Florida, which I think are hugely inspiring when you visit there to see the homes that are being built, the infrastructure that is being laid at pace. I think in Texas, a year or so ago, 70,000 plus new homes were started in the state of Texas alone. Look what's happening in London right now by comparison. There are boroughs of London, like Camden, where in the first quarter of this year, 17 homes were given planning permission. 17 homes, for goodness sake. I think the stats I saw this morning were that in May, the month of May, only 24 new houses were sold in the whole of London. 24 new houses. There are villages in my constituency where more than 24 new homes were sold in that month. This is a complete disgrace. And as a result of it, we're destroying economic growth and we're shredding the social contract for young people. And there is a generation of angry young people, and they're right to be angry, who can't get on the housing ladder, are being overtaxed, had the first years of their adult life at university destroyed by overbearing COVID regulations. These people need the Conservative Party to stand up for them. And that means we've got to reform the planning system. I think we should advocate for zonal planning in our big cities so we can get building in places like London and the cities that I know and grew up in, like Manchester, Wolverhampton, Derby, Nottingham, Leicester, which are crying out for regeneration. There's a moral mission there as well, because these cities are dying at the moment because they need aspirational middle-class families back into them, not just social housing and students. the Conservative Party should lead the charge on this, just as some great Republican governors have done over in the United States. And then the last area that I was going to mention is around migration. And here, I think there is a great lesson to be learned from what's happened in the United States, because there has been this completely false economic narrative on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly here, that you have to have high levels of legal migration to drive economic growth. This is totally wrong. That economic model has been a disaster. Tony Blair was the founding father of it. It's been perpetuated by successive governments for 25 years. It has not led to high economic growth. If it had, we would have had the greatest economic growth since the Industrial Revolution. We've had the reverse. It's led to British workers' wages being undercut, and it's led to businesses not investing in innovation, in technology, in robotics. We have the lowest uptake of robotics of any G7 country right now. As a percentage, if you compare robots to people, we're the lowest, I think, of almost any European country. That model has failed. And the United States this year has proven that it's failed, because you're seeing the numbers of people coming into the US falling, and yet economic growth increasing. I think it's the first year in living memory in which the number of foreign-born citizens in the US has actually fallen, and yet we've had economic growth of 3.3%, something in that region. So the lesson of that is that we've got to radically reduce migration and then be immensely careful about who we bring into this country. I advocate, and it's a logical conclusion of the policies that Kemi and our front bench in the Home Affairs area have been setting out with respect to ILR and changes to the visa system, net emigration, where fewer people come in every year than are leaving. If we choose the right people, the coders, the serial entrepreneurs, the consultant doctors, the people who are going to be genuine economic contributors to our country, I think we'll fire economic growth in the years ahead. And that is something we can take real inspiration from the Trump administration and the approach over in the United States. So those are 4 things that I would do, which I think have the potential to meet the moment, answer some of the deep well of anger and frustration and disillusionment that Henry is absolutely right to speak of, that there is here in the UK, and can actually give hope by setting the UK on a stronger trajectory for the future.
Rob, thank you. I'll come to Miriam next. Now, Miriam, one of the key theme of the event today is that of the kind of political shift of what's been referred to as the realignment. And in a way, you've had a bit of a microcosmic journey with that, sort of with the successes of 2019 and then the catastrophe of 2024. And you've been at the sharp edge of the rise of reform. I think it's fair to say. But you've also written very powerfully and interestingly about the impacts of an economy that does not work for a wide enough range of people, whether that's geographically or whether it is more demographically. You've spoken in particular about young men and boys. From your perspective, where do you think we've gone wrong and what needs to change?
Thanks, Gavin. I grew up in Sheffield in the 80s and 90s, so I witnessed firsthand the deindustrialisation. And I remember, of course, Sheffield used to have an enormous steel industry, no longer, sadly. I mean, in the town that I represented, Stocksbridge, once upon a time, 11,000 local men worked in the steelworks. It was 750 by the time I was unelected, and that plant is now about to close. It's gone into administration. So, I mean, that's just what happened across South Yorkshire. And I remember in the 80s and 90s in primary school singing rhymes about how we wanted to kill Margaret Thatcher. I mean, their hatred for the Conservatives was that strong in places like Sheffield, because people felt abandoned to hopelessness, to welfare. And that's why I think it took 40 years for the Conservatives to rebuild trust with those kind of people who are actually socially conservative. And if it wasn't for the deindustrialisation, probably would have turned back to the Tories much sooner. But, I remember knocking on doors in 2019. I was not involved in politics in 2017, but I understand there's a similar sentiment back then. was that people had felt that the government since 97, really they'd pinned their hopes on Labour, but actually they'd got more of the same. They'd got an elite that were more interested in global interests than national interests, and an economy that just wasn't working evenly across the country. And of course, Boris capitalised on that vibe. We must remember that the realignment did start with Brexit. Actually, in 2017, the Conservatives did very well. The difference in 2019 was the Labour vote collapsed. So I think the realignment was not just about Boris. It was about much more than that. So I think that's important to remember. But of course, we were then elected with this amazing majority. We did deliver Brexit, but unfortunately, so much went wrong. Obviously, the pandemic, huge amount of spending that then led to the inflation that I think was a big part of the loss, and of course immigration. We don't need to talk about that. And the problem that I think probably the Conservative Party still has, and possibly Reform may have if it comes into government, is that there may be a big C Conservative majority in Parliament, but there certainly wasn't a small c Conservative majority in the last Parliament. And Rob will remember back to things like the Safety of Rwanda Act, where we had some great ideas for making sure human rights claims could not be made by individuals. But sadly, only 60 of our colleagues were willing to vote for those amendments, and yet that would have solved the small boat crisis. We wouldn't be where we are today. So I think, there's a lot to be said for how badly the last government understood the problems. But nevertheless, we are where we are. And I personally don't think it will be difficult for the right to win the next election. I mean, the jury's out how that happens, whether the Conservative Party can recover, whether there's a coalition, all those kind of things. But people still want a government that puts the national interest first and gives them hope. I think these are the basic things that people want. That's where the Blairite consensus completely failed. And they still see the elite, whether that's the Labour Party today or the Conservative Party yesterday, as prioritising their own interests and the interests of asylum seekers and global investment and the EU over the nation. And I think that the demand is still there for a pro-nation politics. That cannot be too hard to capitalise on. But what do you do when you get into power? How do you keep power? And how do you solve these very, very deep economic problems that we've been talking about? Solving immigration is an absolute prerequisite for doing anything else, because no matter whether it's an economic issue or not, it is a huge fairness issue. And no political party is going to get any hearing at all unless they solve that problem. And that's why I think at the moment Reform will probably win the next election, because they're the only party not tainted with having failed on this issue over frequent elections. But I'm more pessimistic, I'm afraid, than the panel about solving the economic issues. And one of the reasons for that is that I don't actually think that it will be easy to achieve growth, even if all these great policies are put into place. Of course we need to deregulate, of course we need lower taxes, of course we need to free up house building. I don't disagree with that, but I think what we are underestimating is the impact of the demographic decline that this country is facing. And I think our population is so completely unaware of what's going on in that space that it's going to be very difficult for the right to sell the kind of reforms, and let's face it, cuts and austerity that will probably be necessary to save the economy. Now, what do I mean by demographic decline? Well, since the 1970s, our birth rate has been below replacement. So essentially every generation has been slightly smaller than the one before. Now, we have masked that with immigration. That hasn't been an economic success, but nevertheless it's masked the fact that we are failing to produce enough young people into the workplace to replace those who are leaving. And actually in recent years that total fertility rate, if you like, the birth rate has collapsed. I mean, it's 1.4 children per woman. That means that every 100 British people alive today, I don't know how many are in this room, but let's say it was 100, you will have just 44 grandchildren between you. I mean, that's a serious population decline in just 2 generations. And no amount of tax cuts and deregulation and looking at the Laffer curve is going to solve that fundamental structural problem. And I think the problem on the right is we hark back to the days of Thatcher and say, if we could just repeat her amazing dynamic economic policies. Well, there's something in that. But also she benefited from the coming of age of that baby boom. All those babies that were born after the war, 900,000 babies were born in 1961. It was fewer than 600,000 last year. They came of age in the Thatcher government. They were at their most productive. They were at their most dynamic. For the first time, people delayed having children, so they were 100% committed to the workplace. And she reaped that demographic reward. And that's one of the reasons, one of the main reasons, actually, that the economy grew in her time. We do not have that today. In 1980, there were 10 20-year-olds for every 6 60-year-olds in this country, 10 to 6. There are now 5 20-year-olds to every 6 60-year-olds in this country. Now, you think that what that does just to dynamism in a workplace, and never mind the cost of paying pensions being now spread over far fewer people. And I think this is a problem that we can't solve, or at least quickly. Even if the birth rate went back up today, I mean, wouldn't that be amazing? But even if it did, we've got 20, 30 years of locked-in demographic decline, where we've gone from 4.5 people paying each person's pension in 1970 to 3 today and 2 very shortly. That is the one explanation we have for higher taxes than ever before. Declining NHS, huge debt, huge deficit. It's just the maths of it. And I think on the right, we're going to have to get to grips with it, that these amazing policies that we can and should employ, reindustrialisation, cutting taxes, absolutely, are not going to be enough to bring back a standard of living that we've had in the past and we've been living on in debt for the past couple of decades. So my concern is that the right gets into power. It does a great job of sorting immigration, which gives us a year or two's grace with the electorate. But then the cold, hard facts are we cannot solve these economic problems, or certainly not quickly. And so what I would advocate now is rolling the pitch. We've got to explain to the electorate how deep the problems are and why. We've got to explain that the state pension is a benefit, that there is no pot with your name on. And I think this is the one thing that really frustrated me on the doorstep, and I'm afraid still frustrates me as a broadcaster, is that whenever you talk about pensions and the need to end the triple lock, or the fact that we might have to means test them, you get this wall of, well, I paid for it, it's mine, how dare you take it away from me? And of course, that's not how it works in this country, sadly, and people have been lied to over generations. But I think rolling the pitch is going to be very painful, and it may actually cost us an election or two, or certainly keep us away from big majorities. But I think morally, it's the only thing that we can do. We cannot pretend that a few tax cuts and deregulations and opening up some more planning sites is going to solve this fundamental demographic problem that we have. We have to have another solution. We have to find a way of giving people hope without giving them false hope. And I don't have an answer to that, but I do think the right thing to do is to start explaining to the electorate just what is going to have to be necessary to get through the next period of time.
Thanks, Miriam. Just on those shocking demographics, I hope you don't get this wrong, but I think our mutual friend, the MP Neil O'Brien, did a rough calculation that if you took the economy and the spending plans of today and wound them back to the demographics of just 20 years ago, the saving would be so big that you could actually cut income tax by 13p in the pound.
80 billion.
Well, there we go. Yeah. 80 billion. So the relationship between the size of the state, the economy, the labour market and demographics, I think, is something which has been underappreciated, and I think it's good that people are talking about it now. Nick, I'm just going to come back to you for a question. So you've written quite a lot about what you call ultra-liberalism, both in the social sphere, but also when it comes to economic policy. And I feel like sometimes when I'm having these debates and discussions with other people on the political right, and I say things like, well, 30 years of economic liberalism has clearly not worked. They come back to me and say, well, what liberalism? We haven't had liberalism when it comes to energy. We haven't had liberalism when it comes to housing. We haven't had liberalism when it comes to planning. There are all of these supply-side interventions that we can and should be doing. I always think that's a reasonably fair challenge. I sort of think there's more to it. But what would you say if someone came back to you with that sort of critique?
Well, they're partly right. I think we're just talking about different things and talking past one another when we have those conversations.
Yeah.
So which is why I think the kind of reforms that we need have to be considered full spectrum. So absolutely, we need to liberalise the planning system. Absolutely, we need to look at over-regulation in particular when it comes to things like environmental protections and administrative law, which are the things that seem to hold us back from building things, whether it's housing or new infrastructure or whatever. But I think that the liberalism that we're talking about, the economic liberalism we're talking about, is about things like globalization and the complete disregard for the fact that globalization has served the Western wealthy incredibly well, and it's definitely improved living standards around the world, but it has completely screwed the Western working class and increasingly the middle class as well. And actually there's a linkage because you can actually only do certain domestic policies if you are also doing the liberal globalizing policies. So we can only afford to make our energy impossibly expensive and undermine our industry in doing so, because we're effectively just outsourcing our emissions to other countries. So I understand what they're saying, and they're right about things like planning. But I think the argument that you and I have made about the logic of economic liberalism as it applies to things like trade, as it applies to actually aspects of the public sector and the logic of kind of creating quasi markets and lots and lots of outsourcing with no accountability anywhere, still holds.
Henry, I think the panel's violently agreeing on a lot. Perhaps where there's a slight divergence is with regard to your comments on public spending, especially on social security, and you talked about protecting welfare budgets and so on. Is it not the case that the context is quite different in the UK than in the US, because we do have much more of a social welfare infrastructure, and that as a share of our national spending is much higher, and the point's been made multiple times today, the overall fiscal picture is just much tighter and more challenging for the UK. Is it not the case that if we were to improve economic performance, if we were to improve economic growth, if we were to re-industrialize with high value, highly productive jobs, shouldn't you actually be able to get social security spending down, and the number of, not necessarily by slashing the level of people's entitlements, but by having fewer people reliant on social security because they're in productive jobs?
Yeah, now of course for an American, Social Security means something different than it means for you. You know, for us that's our pension program, and I know what you're speaking of is something much broader than that. Yes, but is that if you need to cut public spending in order to get there, which is what I'm hearing, is that you must cut public spending as you are doing this, that it can't be a lagniappe, it cannot be a reward for the increased growth, it must be done at the same time. What you need to do is make sure that the people who have a good moral case don't get cut. And it is different to say that, you know, that if you have £1 million house, you still get £12,000 a year in state pension, or however much you get, than it is to say we need to limit pension spending. Who deserves support from the state in a time when money is scarce? I suspect if you approach it from that direction rather than the money direction, you will have more likelihood of gaining support from your voters, which is to say that economically downscale, hard-pressed C1, C2, and DE voters. 2019 was the first time in your history where I talked about that curve. According to the YouGov poll, it was inverted. You did better among C2 DE than you did among AB C1. There's another poll that showed it was roughly level. But your potential voters are downscale. They must be protected during the initial scale. And if you look at public spending from who deserves it rather than how do I find the money, you will probably find a lot of money from people who actually don't deserve the benefits in any moral case. Some of that will be the shirker who ought to be working. Some of that will be, I love Katie Lamb's X feed, British welfare for British citizens.
That's quite popular in this room.
Yeah, great. But it extends also to, you know, I'm sure it extends to people otherwise. Why is it that, I mean, I don't know how much, we had an argument last night over dinner, how much people who earn 100 or 200,000 pounds pay to send their child to university. Why should they receive any public support rather than bear the full cost? How much do they pay in capital gains? You know, is that when you're talking about somebody who's making, you know, I'm trying to remember where your band rates come, but you know, somebody who's making a reasonable income is making somewhere in the 20,000, being paid 20%, you know, paying 20% plus the NIC. How much do you pay in capital gains rate? Much lower than that. So if you take $1 in capital gains, you pay like 40% of the tax rate. Why not equalize it a little bit? That sort of way of approaching tax revenue, that sort of way of approaching public spending will solidify your political support while solving your fiscal crisis and give you the breathing room for this sort of thing to provide the fiscal upscale. But if you look at it from money first and not morals first, you will not have the political support. That is the lesson from the United States over and over and over again. When you try to cut spending and you don't do it through a moral lens, it does not succeed in the absence of an emergency, a catastrophe. Now, perhaps your fiscal catastrophe will come, and then you will have the moral legitimacy to cut, because it's those bastards at the IMF who bailed you out and so forth. But in the absence of that, in the absence of compulsion, in the absence of being treated like the Eurobank treated the pigs in the bailout crisis, it's taken Greece a decade of austerity to return to growth. In the absence of that compulsion, you have to look at cutting spending through the moral lens first and the money lens second. Otherwise, you do not have the political capacity in your downscale coalition, which is your coalition. You cannot wish an upscale coalition back. Is your coalition. If you do it that way, you actually might be surprised how much you can save while also expanding your support.
That's interesting. Thank you. Rob, just picking up on the theme of the moral dimension there, something that's come up a few times today is the need to sort of remoralize our conversation about the economy, because economic policy can sound extremely dry. It can feel very downstream from the day-to-day. And also a lot of the things that it might be necessary to do to generate growth do involve trade-offs, and they may involve a little bit of pain for certain groups at particular points in time. I'm always reminded, though, of, even though I think my own view is that there were some downsides to the way it was done, the conversation around austerity shortly after the financial crisis was conducted in a moral way, because people said it was wrong to be visiting huge amounts of debt on future generations. And that was a way in which I think the conversation was actually held rather honestly, and voters did come to accept the need for a little bit of pain for future gain. I think the obvious parallel today is around questions of housing and opportunity and access to asset ownership and so on. How can we sort of be more positive and remoralize that conversation and make people really think about opportunity for future generations, even if it means difficult decisions now?
Good question. I mean, just to answer Henry's point, the IMF, I don't actually think, could afford to bail out the UK today. So they're not, even the bastards at the IMF are not coming to our rescue. The situation is so bad. But I actually agree with a lot of what Henry's just said. And to answer your question, I think the Conservative Party, or indeed anyone on the centre-right, has to understand who we're in politics for. And today, I think certainly the Conservative Party struggles to answer that question. And at its best, it was always abundantly clear who we were in politics for. And who am I in politics for? Well, it is for people who are striving and who are trying to get on, but have not yet made it. It is for the people I grew up in and around when I was growing up as a child in Wolverhampton. It's small business people. It's the people I represent now in Newark who work in actually quite tough jobs. You know, I don't have lots of rich people in my constituency. They go to work every day in distribution centres and food processing factories. They're reps who get into cars and drive up and down the motorway every day and don't get home to put their kids to bed at the end of the day. So I think the centre absolutely has to understand who it's in business for and take decisions through that lens. And it did do that in recent years. Time and again, it didn't do that. And often, the case for a particular policy was perfectly rational. You know, let's abolish IR35 because it's not an economically sensible and fair way to treat people who are self-employed or sole traders. But those are the risk takers that Conservatives are in business to support. So maybe we should give them preferential treatment and ensure that they have a slightly easier route through the tax system than somebody else. You know, if there's someone on modest means who wants to invest in buying a buy-to-let property because they don't understand the stock market, but we Brits understand a bit about houses and think that we could make an investment in a terraced house down the road in Newark. Don't make it impossible for that person to go and do it by taxing them out of existence. I think we've got to have a much clearer sense of who we are, and they are exactly the sorts of people that you describe. And then what flows from that are choices, obviously, about to whom do you divert the finite resources that the state has? Who do we tax? And I think we should be doing everything that we can within the confines of what is realistic to be supporting those people who are just getting started in life, who are in work, who are trying to raise a family, trying to get on the housing ladder. And sometimes that will be at the expense of people who are already asset rich, who are already doing well in life. And maybe that is a big shift in thinking for the Conservative Party, which has become heavily reliant on older people who already have things. But we've got to make that shift, because that's where our voters are, and it's absolutely the morally and economically right move for the country.
And just really briefly, Miriam, just on the point that you finished with on the demographics, that does seem to be the kind of the big elephant in the room of our time. Realistically, we're not going to completely turn that around overnight. There are some things that some countries and jurisdictions of countries have done that have helped a bit. Obviously, we can make housing more affordable, but people tell us in polls that they want to start families and have children. It's not about telling people how to live, but people have fewer children than they say they would like to have, and they normally cite material factors, especially housing costs, or the fact that they need 2 incomes, and that just makes it very difficult, as the reason why they don't have the families that they want to have, and that's got really downstream economic consequences as well as being socially disastrous. So this is probably a bit of an unfair question, but if there was just a couple of things you could do, next week to change the way we instill it, even if you were the world king or world queen for a week, what things would you do to try and?
Well, I think it's really important to understand the problem, and there is this common view that people are just having fewer children than they want, but that's actually very simplistic. The number of children per mother has not changed since the 1970s. Women who have a child are just as likely to have 2, 3 or 4 children as they were in the 1970s. In fact, in the US, family size per mother has gone up amazingly since the 1970s. What has changed is the number of women who, and obviously we measure women for obvious reasons, but of course this applies to men, the number of women who never have a child at all. In 1970, the childlessness rate, the total childlessness rate was 5%. It's now 30%. So that's the difference. The fall in the birth rate across all Western countries is entirely accounted for by the number of women who now don't have children rather than falling family size. So the problem we have is, why don't women have that first child? Because only 8% of women say they don't want children. That hasn't changed really much over the decades. It's not about stated intention, but something stops women having that first child. Now, we could talk about this literally all day. There's a huge link between the age of first child, finding partner, all these kind of things. So let's not get into that. But you're right, we can't solve this overnight. But I think one thing we can look at is the welfare state, welfarism. And of course, the welfare state was established with fantastic intentions to look after the poorest after the Second World War, when everybody had contributed so equally, so sacrificially, it made sense. But actually, in some ways, welfarism has destroyed the family, because if you can rely on the state rather than your family, then of course you will. Because if you can't be bothered to go to work in the morning, but the person who has to support you if you don't is your mum or dad or your spouse or your aunt or your uncle, you wouldn't dare, they'll kick you out. But if you can claim benefit, if you can say, I've got ADHD and I'm not feeling very well today, and actually I might not be able to go to work, and it's no cost to your nearest and dearest, the faceless taxpayer will foot the bill, then of course you're going to do that. I think the problem with the welfare state is it's fundamentally misunderstood how human nature works, what incentivizes us, why relationships are important. And this is really the problem with the state pension, is that people are deciding not to have children because they know that somebody else's children will pay tax that will pay for their pension and their healthcare in their old age. That just wasn't an option 100 years ago. If you wanted financial security, you needed a family. And I think we have taken away the link between having children and personal financial security that has existed since human beings evolved. And I think that's had massive consequences for family size, for desire to have children, for needs to have children. Now, I'm not suggesting we scrap all pensions tomorrow, that would be political suicide. But I think we do need to rethink the welfare state in terms of what it's rewarding. And at the end of the day, the purpose of government, from a conservative point of view, from a Christian point of view, is to punish the good and reward the bad. And I think we have, sorry, to punish the bad. Let's start that again. Please don't clip that bit for Twitter.
That's exactly why people don't like the Tories, Miriam.
Exactly. This is why we're the nasty party, right? But at the moment, we have to consider, does our welfare state punish the bad and reward the good? No, it doesn't. Like, just think about universal credit. If you are a couple with children and you are on universal credit, you get more money by living apart. Like, that's insane. So there are things like that we could change very, very quickly that makes the welfare state something that incentivises pro-family behaviour rather than disincentivises it. That wouldn't solve the birth rate crisis overnight whatsoever, but it would make family the first port of call for people's provision, as it always has been, rather than the state, and I think that would start to change the vibe.